Well, it finally happened. The news that we've all been waiting for. Matty Beniers is back with the Kraken. Or, I guess more, isn't leaving the Kraken. Not that there was really ever any chance that he was going to in the first place. The point is, the Kraken have re-signed Matty Beniers, and it's a contract that makes me wonder if Ron Francis maybe spent a little bit too much time at the slots in Vegas while he was there for the draft, as it is now the third contract he's signed this offseason, somewhat uncharacteristically over his course as a GM, that will span 7 years, this time worth $7.14 million per year. Or more specifically, for the people that really like all the details, it's $7.142857 million per year, which, if that seems unnecessarily complicated, it's because it comes out to $50 million over the course of the full 7-year contract. You split 50 by 7, you end up getting a somewhat ugly looking number when it comes to the AAV. Now, if those numbers seem somewhat familiar to you for some reason, 7 years by 7.14, etc. per year, it's probably because this is the exact same contract, at least in amount of years and amount per year, that Montour signed with the Kraken for back at the start of free agency a little over a month ago. And like that contract with Montour, though maybe to a greater extent and for somewhat different reasons, there's no way of getting around the fact that whether or not you like or love or maybe don't like this contract for Beniers, it is absolutely a gamble that the Kraken are making here. But before we get into the gamble the Kraken are making, I do have to admit that this is not the contract I was expecting to see the Kraken sign Beniers to. I was absolutely expecting them to sign a contract with Beniers, which is really why I hadn't bothered talking about it much past what I said going into the offseason. It was always inevitable that Beniers was going to sign with the Kraken, even more so than done the previous year. So even though it did kind of drag on for a while, it really didn't worry me that it was dragging on a little bit longer than maybe we would have liked it to. Still, I can understand why a lot of people were talking about it. There really hasn't been much else to talk about around the Kraken since, a couple days into free agency. Either way, I was definitely expecting this to be more of a bridge type of contract, and I've said that multiple times, kind of the 2 to 3 year deal worth more like $4, maybe $5 million per year, especially given the down second season that Beniers did have, especially on the offensive end of things. And Beniers' sophomore slump did play a big role in why I was thinking more of a bridge type of deal. Had he come out in that second season and improved on his previous one, or at least played up to the same level that he did in that Calder winning season his rookie year, then I think it would have been fair to expect more of this type of long-term deal, though maybe worth more per year than what he ends up getting with this contract. It's the type of thing with that bridge deal where it gives the team a chance to, over a couple more seasons, make sure that Beniers is going to bounce back before they really invest the big money into him, where on Beniers' end, it gives him a chance to have a couple of years to then earn bigger money when that deal does come around, especially with the salary cap going to make likely some big leaps and bounds over these next few seasons. Though at the same time, as we know with that last part, it's not necessarily a given that the salary cap will continue to go up by significant chunks each of the next few years, especially with potentially a lockout coming here with the new CBA due in just a couple of years' time. Either way, after an inconsistent first couple of seasons in the NHL for Beniers, it would have given both camps a chance to really know what his career was likely to hold, or at least what trajectory it would have been on after a larger sample size, given at that point he'd be more 4 to 5 years into his career rather than just the 2 that we've seen so far. Obviously, though, that's not the route the team ended up going, as they do just give him that long-term deal worth, well, what is now the highest paid forward deal for the Kraken on their roster. And like I said, in part because of those inconsistent first couple of seasons, especially in the offensive end for Beniers, this contract absolutely is a gamble for the Kraken. It's higher risk, but potentially with higher reward. And because I do typically, at least when I can anyway, like to end things on a bit of a higher note, we'll start with that higher risk end of things, at least from a Kraken perspective, with the gamble that they're making with this Beniers contract. Now, obviously, there is always the chance, even if it's not necessarily what I think is going to happen, or it's certainly not what we hope is going to happen with Beniers, but there is the chance that this last season for him is more of what we're going to see and come to expect from his career, that offensively, he just isn't the player that we thought he was going to be after that Calder winning season. Maybe that's because he isn't really able to put on much more pounds into that taller frame and continues to be easy to push off the puck and bully away from it. And in part, that was, I think, somewhat exaggerated because of the dump and chase offensive system that Hackstall liked to run that really relied on the forward check and having to be physical to get the puck in the forward end, something that Beniers in particular in the early part of his career has not necessarily always excelled at. And in that worst case scenario, I think it probably goes without saying that if Beniers doesn't get things turned around offensively, he will not be worth that $7+ million per year over the next 7 seasons. So heck, even coming into this, he certainly was not worth $7 million plus this last season, and I don't think you can really make a particularly strong argument that he was worth $7+ million even in his Calder winning year. I think probably more in the range of 5.5 might be more reasonable from that season, working towards the 7, but not quite there yet. And then obviously, well, yeah, definitely not worth that last year. So then with that being the case, there's obviously going to be a lot of questions, and some fair questions, as to why you would pay him this much if he hasn't been worth this much in either of his first 2 seasons and has trended downwards. Now, personally, I think there's some pretty good reasons why he trended downwards and had that sophomore slump, one of which out of his control was how the team around him played. The entire team trended significantly downwards offensively, and even in that context, I think there's an argument to be made that Beniers, even outside of how the team around him was playing, regressed offensively, and it's hard to ignore that he didn't seem quite as good along the boards as he did in his first season, even with good hands and a knack that he showed, especially in the first half of his rookie season, for even with a smaller frame, or at least less weight on his frame, an ability to get pucks away from bigger players along the boards, especially in the offensive end. He was consistently getting pushed off of pucks, even in open ice at times throughout last season, and part of that was because he was drawing a lot more of the top defensive attention from other teams, being that he was consistently the first line center with the highest scoring line the Kraken had out on the ice, or at least theoretically their best offensive trio that they could put out there. Now, it didn't always end up manifesting that way, but still, Beniers was drawing a lot more attention after the Calder season than he had during the Calder season. Of course, at the same time, if he's going to be, and he now is, the highest paid forward on the team, and especially the center role, he's going to have to figure out and learn how to play through that extra attention. Otherwise, he's not going to be worth this deal. And finally, from a long-term perspective, if indeed the worst case scenario or anything really close to it ends up panning out here with the trajectory of Beniers' career, then the Kraken as a whole might be in some trouble down the road, as they already have the contract signed earlier this offseason in free agency of Montour and Stevenson that we have a pretty good feeling are likely to age poorly, especially into the last 2 or 3 years of those deals. And if you tack on a Beniers contract that is a massive overpay on top of that, well, it's gonna be a rough few years of figuring out how to work around the cap and put a competitive team on the ice if you're pumping in $20 million to 3 guys that can't perform up to the level of those contracts. Now, with all that being said, and the potential doom and gloom that would put on the future of the Kraken franchise, even with all of the future is bright talk that we've had here over the last couple of years, as I said when the contracts of Montour and Stevenson were signed, I don't really think either one of those guys is going to stick around for the full 7-year term of those contracts. I kind of expect that as they do start to age poorly in the last couple seasons, the Kraken will find ways to move on from those contracts, either trading the players away, releasing them, and just eating that cap penalty that they'll have to eat, and who knows what that might look like if anything like that changes in the CBA. I wouldn't really expect it to significantly. But that aside, assuming nothing does change, there's also the chance that they end up retiring. Either way, I don't expect either guy to be on the Kraken roster in 7 years' time unless they just find the fountain of youth and play near what those contracts are worth. Of course, though, hopefully, and maybe this is just the optimistic fan of me talking, I do always like to be optimistic, it's just more fun that way, but I don't really think that that's the way things are likely to go with Beniers. I don't think this contract is going to be a big weight for the Kraken moving forward. The Montour and Stevenson ones are somewhat inevitable that they will be eventually, but that's aside from the point. As far as the Beniers contract is concerned, I think at the very least, especially considering, again, he is just 21 years old and won't turn 22 until we're at least a month into this next season, he still has plenty of time to grow into that frame a little bit more, put some pounds on, and obviously learn the NHL game. Not to mention the fact that we've got a new coaching staff coming in that, at least at the AHL level, has liked to play a much more north and south fast-paced game, which, even if Beniers' strength isn't necessarily his speed, he's not slow, but he also isn't a Connor McDavid speedster or anything like that out there, it still will open up the ice a little bit more and won't force him to play that dump and chase quite as much and have to be fighting for pucks up along the boards and throwing weight around that, quite honestly, he's just going to lose that weight battle more often than not until he does eventually grow into that frame a little bit over the next few seasons. Which, just as a side note, it might just seem wildly hopeful that he's just going to magically put on pounds, but it is something that he, coming into the NHL, had talks with Ron Francis even after he was drafted that was something he was going to have to do. And even between offseason and last season, he put on 10 more pounds before last season. And I'm sure he's been focusing on building that again this year. Now, obviously, putting on a little extra weight didn't necessarily help him last season, but it's a process. He's not going to put on 50 pounds magically over the course of 1 year. I mean, I guess he could, but it probably wouldn't be very good for his game or health in general. And depending on how he did it, it could even be illegal and get him kicked out of the league. So, or suspended, I suppose, maybe not kicked out of the league. Either way, that's not going to happen. It is a process. It'll take some time, but I think he'll find a way of getting there. And even if he doesn't, and even if he doesn't turn into an offensive dynamo, I still would expect his offensive numbers to come up, and they're going to have to if he's going to be worth anywhere near $7 million at any point in time. But there's another part of his game that does give me hope, and it tends to be, especially for a young center towards the top of the lineup, the harder part of the game to learn for most people. But for Beniers, it seems natural, and that is the defensive end of the game, where last season, even in spite of the, again, very underwhelming and disappointing offensive side of his game, the defensive side was just as good, if not better, than his Calder winning season. In part because it kind of had to be. They were spending a lot more time as a team in the defensive end of the ice. But Beniers, even in spite of the struggles and frustrations that come along with that and the added pressure from the Calder season, and I'm sure not the most fun year for him, it didn't affect him in that defensive end of the ice. He continued to be one of the better Kraken forwards defensively, and part of that too was his improved face-off numbers, at least for the first half of the season anyway. Which to me then at the very least means that you have a defensively responsible player and a smart player in his end of the ice, and if you are able to open things up a little bit more offensively, he has shown in the season where they did open things up more offensively that he can contribute, and he still has the skill sets when he can actually get the puck and some ice to show off those skill sets in. So at least to me anyway, regardless of which one you think is more likely or more realistic to end up happening as far as how Beniers' career ends up playing out, there are still a lot of reasons to be optimistic, and I'd say more reasons to be optimistic about how he's going to progress into the next few years, or I guess now 7 years with the Kraken, than there are reasons to be pessimistic and think that this contract is going to end up looking like a huge mistake. And the added bonus is that if things do end up turning out well for Beniers, he bounces back from the sophomore slump and turns into a perennial all-star type of player. This contract, especially by those last few years of it, is going to be an absolute steal for the Kraken. It's a contract that goes well into his prime. It means that the Kraken, even if they do slightly overpay for the next season or two with this contract, if Beniers does continue to improve and develop into his prime, by the end of this contract, they could very well have a player that's worth, in today's cap world, in the $10 to $11 million range, at $7 million in his prime, and that is the type of contract that allows you to add pieces into your team with that extra cap space and potentially go and try to win a cup. Now, obviously, the Kraken would like their cup window to be open a little bit sooner than 7 years from now, but this is the type of thing that we've seen other teams make work. Now, I'm not saying that Beniers' ceiling even is anywhere near Nathan MacKinnon, but it's something we did see the Avalanche kind of pull off with MacKinnon when they were paying him well under his value into that cup winning season. And for what it's worth, when it comes to the advanced stats crowd, and specifically some of them that then project what contracts could look like because of those advanced stats, specifically the evolving hockey guys, well, they did project before this contract came out that it would be right around $7 million for 7 years. So This definitely isn't a wild overpayment for the Kraken. Is it a gamble? Yeah. Could it turn out poorly for them? Yeah, it definitely could, and it could hamstring this team, especially with the other deals signed this offseason for some older players. At the same time, though, it could absolutely end up working out for them, and they could end up getting a very good player for well under what he's worth in just a few years' time. So I suppose in that way, you could look at this Beniers contract if things do end up working out, and we're not even talking necessarily that it has to be the best case scenario. Even if Beniers turns into that perennial all-star or perennial conversation of an all-star, then he'll be well worth more than $7 million, especially with the cap going up over those 7 years as well. And then the fact that Beniers is playing worth more than what he's getting paid in those last few years helps make up for a couple of contracts that Kraken just signed that likely won't be worth what those players are getting paid at that time, especially the other center. Regardless, with all that said, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below about this, other than just being excited to have Beniers back, which I think the vast majority of us anyway definitely are. Even if you're thinking a little bit more pessimistically and that this gamble might not end up working out, the Kraken could end up being somewhat hamstrung in 5, 6, 7 years. Or if you find yourself more like me, glass half full, thinking optimistically that even if Beniers doesn't meet his absolute ceiling, he is likely to be getting underpaid for what he produces for the team in just a few years' time. And at that point, well, that usually helps you add other pieces to then make those deep playoff runs. Let me know what you think. And until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other. God bless, and go Kraken.